We're back. Another edition of Colts Corner with myself, Kevin Bowen. Appreciate Mark Dykton filling in today for Eddie Garrison. It's a podcast I've certainly thought about, unfortunately, now for probably about the past year plus, but still just looking at the red button, it's just kind of crazy that it is happening today. The passing of Jim Irsay at the age of 65, certainly first, before we go any further, to Carly, to Casey, to Kaylin, his 3 daughters, his 10 grandchildren, so many people in that organization just uber close to Jim Irsay, and I think that's what made him such a unique owner. Pete Ward and Jeffrey Gorman are 2 people that immediately come to mind. I know there are a lot of others, so just the family and the friends of Jim and just all the lives he touched directly or indirectly. I start there. Thoughts with all of them. Jim passing at the age of 65, Colts announcing that yesterday. So, Mark, we'll get into Jim Irsay, the man, the owner, all of it here on this podcast. Won't take any Twitter questions, but want to make sure that it started there just before we moved any further. And thank you, by the way, for helping out here.
Not a problem. Yeah, I'm still stunned by the news we got yesterday evening, right before the Pacers tipped off. It was one of those things where we knew he was in poor health for a while, but it was still one of those things that when it came out, I mean, I was floored. I was completely stunned that was actually happening. 65, I don't care what's going on. That is still incredibly young. And obviously, we know his philanthropic aspirations and everything like that. He gave back to the community. He did so much stuff for his former and current players and employees and family, and this city will dearly miss him.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I guess let me start here. I respected, there are a lot of things, frankly, I respected about Jim Irsay. One, I respected that he owned the team with the passion of a fan sitting in section 607. If he needed to get that crowd on his feet for third down, by all means, he'd do it. Hell, he probably was standing on second down. He was that fan in your section standing on second down, which you love him and you hate him at the same time. But that was his passion. He's not sitting in the front row, cheersing with the big corporate people with khakis on and all that. Sure, he might be wearing a nice suit, but he is a pure fan at heart. And I think that's rare, frankly, in ownership in sports, to be that much of a fan. Frankly, I think our city needed that type of owner back when the Colts first moved here in 1984, and certainly his ownership didn't really rise up until more the mid to late 90s with his father's passing. But, the Colts as a franchise, they stunk for those first 10 to 12 years. You needed someone that embraced the underdog role. We weren't the NFL city. We were the basketball state. And I thought he struck a great balance of other owners looking at him like, gosh, look at this crazy uncle, but also being like, man, listen to his respect and reverence for our league. I can't tell you how many times an Irsay media session included him mentioning the Hallases, mentioning the Maras, mentioning the Rooneys, mentioning the Clark Hunt or the Hunts of the world. And just the amount of respect he talked about the rest of the NFL ownership and the league itself. The whole shield, I get probably gets a little overblown, but he embraced that. So I think that balance of, hey, I'm going to be the kid on the playground that stands up for the kids that can't speak. And that's kind of how our city was a little bit in the early NFL years. But also, when I go in that room, I'm also going to have the respect from everybody around the league because I grew up in the NFL. I didn't just fall into this at the age of 55 or 60 and got rich and decided to buy an NFL team. I grew up in an NFL lifestyle, NFL family, and I know what the league means. I think those two balances, Mark, the fan in him, but also having great historical reverence for the league, was important in not only carrying our flag, but also drawing the ears of some owners.
And I feel like you saw that a lot in the social media posts from other NFL teams yesterday, because NFL teams, when something like this happens, we'll send out thoughts and prayers and this and that. But there was actually detail. If you read the messages, there was detailed messages about how much Jim Irsay meant to those specific teams and what he meant to the league and everything like that. And you just don't get that with a lot of owners.
I'm glad you said that. I want to read, I guess, 2 statements one from an owner, Robert Kraft, arguably the biggest competitor to Jim Irsay throughout his reign. And then 2, Herb Simon, the owner right here for the Indiana Pacers. This from Robert Kraft. Jim brought a unique, spirited energy into the room and had an unmistakable presence. Jim's boldness defined his legacy not just as the steward of the Colts, but as someone who never shied away from being unapologetically himself. His contributions to our league and his compassion for his community will leave a lasting mark. That was Robert Kraft. The one that really struck me was Herb Simon. Again, the Pacers owner said this: "We are deeply saddened by the passing of our dear friend Jim Irsay. Jim took the time today to cheer us on." For those that missed it, Jim did have a tweet, his last tweet, about saying good luck to the Pacers before Game 1, and then fitting how that game ended. Herb Simon said further, "He was more than the owner of the Colts. He was a transformative figure in our city and state, a passionate advocate for the community, and someone whose generosity, vision, and spirit touched countless lives. Jim helped shape our city into the sports capital it is today, and his legacy, both on and off the field, will continue to inspire us in generations to come." I think both of those statements, one from the competitor, one from your partner slash not always your partner in this city because you're kind of competing for some pockets, for both of them to say those words really, really stood out to me.
Yeah, and I mean, I would even go a step further. The Baltimore Ravens statement about the Irsays, and obviously there is a storied history with the Colts and the Ravens.
That's a great point.
And that one was very touching as well. So I didn't get a chance to look at all of them, but the ones that I did see, whether it was the Ravens or the Patriots or Robert Kraft or the Bears or whoever it was, they all had something endearing to say about just the man that Jim Irsay was, the impact he left not only in the league, but the teams that he obviously had no ownership in. He had a big impact just across the league and across the sport, and you see the players coming out of the woodwork and Chuck Pagano and all those other guys just coming out and saying, "We will miss you dearly. You were more than just a boss. You were a friend," and all this stuff. So his impact is far and wide-ranging, not just in the sports landscape, but in the community that he built around Indianapolis as well.
I think I speak for you in saying maybe our favorite Irsay clip is the "We Will Rock You" video after the 49ers win back a couple of seasons ago on Sunday Night Football. And like those Irsay locker room scenes, again, that is pure, raw fandom. And like, I'd rather have that. I'd rather have the owner that, sure, sometimes he said some stuff that you want to pull your hair out on and off the field, frankly. But give me, if I got to rein one in, let me rein that in. I don't want the owner that's just simply saying, hey, I'm going to penny pinch everything, or I'm buying this and I don't really care. We'll see how it goes. If it goes into the ground, whoop-de-doo. And like that aspect to him, I think is what you want in professional sports. And certainly there are a lot of markets that don't talk about their owner in this light. You think the New York Knicks right now, the Pacers, talk about their owner in that light? I was always struck by how publicly he was in calling out Daniel Snyder a couple seasons ago. That might have been his last big moment, if you will. Sadly, we haven't heard from him a lot in the last 18 months, and certainly his health has a ton to do with it. I think he mentioned in a story last year, maybe 26 surgeries in like 7 years was the number that he threw out there, and certainly many trips to rehab as well. So, obviously as his health started to deteriorate, you didn't see him as front-facing as he certainly liked to be. But the Daniel Snyder one of basically saying, I'm going public with my stance and displeasure and disagreement for his actions. Sometimes in those old boy clubs, Mark, you don't get that.
No.
You don't get the public attack of another. A lot of times in those rooms, it can say, hey, we're in an elite company. Our business stays behind these closed doors. We don't call each other out, blah, blah, blah. But it reached a point where he felt like he needed to do something. And I felt like when he did that, it almost was kind of a weight lifted off the rest of the NFL ownership circles of like, oh, he said that. Now we all can follow in line.
Yeah. And I would also say that as an owner as well, fans don't get to see the owner very much. He was very visible as an owner. He was out at training camp. He was riding around in the golf cart, handing out money to fans and everything like that. You don't get that with ownership a lot. And a lot of times it's just, press releases and statements in there or anything like that. He was active on Twitter. He was active at game days. He was active at training camp. He was a visible owner. And I think that kind of gave fans a comfort that you just don't get with sports ownership. You're like, okay, Jim's running the show. He's out and about. He's doing stuff. We might not agree with everything. Yes, we have plenty of sound bites that we love playing from the show, but we also never got the slap on the hand where they said, hey, stop playing that or anything like that. I think he embraced that kind of aspect of it too. He liked being active. He liked being involved. He liked being seen. And so it's a sad day for a lot of people that, he's just not going to be, we don't know if we're going to ever see that again from an owner. Like, we'll see the press releases and this and that, and you usually didn't see the owner unless there was like a firing or something like that. But he was out in front of it all the time with the Jonathan Taylor contract dispute at training camp. I'll always remember that he had the bus out there and he was meeting with the media right after it happened.
And I would argue for the most part, Mark, he did that good or bad.
Yeah.
And
he was never shy.
And again, lately it had waned, and I think his health certainly contributed to some of that. He had a quote that I've thought about because sadly this day, unfortunately, there's been a couple moments over the years where it's like, boy, I hear Jim's not doing very well. So I've thought about, this moment and, the obit and this podcast a little bit. And I'll never forget, he had a quote to the New York Times back in 2005 where he said, I consider myself a really serious businessman, but I also think big business can have a big heart. That quote sounds like a great PR statement. A PR agency comes up with that quote for their big-time clients. Boy, that sounds great. Mm-hmm. But I genuinely believe that heart was met with purity. And like he wanted to do these things. He wanted the Irsay YMCA, the Wheeler Mission, the raising money for Indianapolis Public Schools during COVID, hey, we're going to place the Super Bowl rings around town and do a big scavenger hunt and raise money for that. We had a couple stories just during our show develop where, and I can't tell you how many people have reached out, been like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but we had a dying family member and boom, Irsay caught wind of it and said, you need a plane to go somewhere? Ryan Kelly told the story of his two sons being born. Boom, plane to Nashville, abruptly, back to Indianapolis. But two stories that we had heard today. One, LaPel, Indiana, which for those unfamiliar is like a northeast, I wouldn't call it a suburb of Indianapolis, probably 20, 30 minutes from Indy here. And their youth sports organization had a fire happen at their complex. Lost all their equipment. Boom, Irsay, here's the money. Fully new funded from an equipment standpoint. That is maybe a little bit more obvious to an owner, but this one's a little bit more behind the scenes. We had a manager at a local Qdoba say to us that one of his workers came up to him and mentioned that Jim Irsay had paid for his college. And the manager of the Qdoba was like, whoa, tell me, more about this. Well, the Qdoba worker's mom was a part of the housing staff at Jim Irsay's, I'll call it a compound here in Indianapolis, just north of Indianapolis, because it certainly is quite the complex, but part of the housing staff there. And Irsay had I say rule, there's probably a better term for it, but said to any member of his staff at that house, if your children maintain good grades and you continue to work for me, I will send your kids, plural, to college. And the kid was telling the story to the manager at Qdoba and said at that point, and this is like a decade ago, at that point, he had sent 80 kids to college.
Unbelievable.
Through that. And that's not seeing the light of day. That's not leading the 6 o'clock news. That's not and that's just kind of who he is. I had a few behind the scenes interactions with him, and we'll never forget being at the owners meetings in Atlanta back in, I guess it would have been 2015, 20. I guess he was arrested in 2014. I think I did the first interview with him in his hotel room. I want to say it was 2015. It was a Super Bowl year. They were bidding for a Super Bowl with New Orleans and Miami. And just watching him behind the scenes interact with the hotel staff. I mean, low level, and the genuine nature to it. I'll never forget being in his office at West 56th Street. No cameras around. One of his security members brings in their high school age son, and the joy on Jim's face to take the high school son around his office, show him all the various memorabilia around there, was like a kid on Christmas morning. And I think that is real. Again, these are no cameras around. That's not fake. That's none of it. I don't know. That's just really pure to me. And I handing out the $100 bills at training camp practice. All of that, I think, takes a special heart.
Yeah, I mentioned it on our show this morning. I said Jim Irsay embodies what you would hope every billionaire would be like, where, yes, he's got the money, he's got the fame, he can buy all the fancy guitars he wants, but he gives back. He puts that money back into the community that's around him. He gives it back to the people that work for him, who will probably never even sniff the kind of money he's had, but he makes sure that he gives back to the community. He gives back to the players. There's a reason why players, what did we say, 3 players have had him induct them into the Hall of Fame. That doesn't happen. That just does not happen in other circles.
I guess let's go there next, Mark, because I would say arguably as a football, that might stand out to me the most. Purely football owner, I think the fact that Edgerrin James, Marvin Harrison, and Dwight Freeney chose Jim Irsay to present them, each of them, into the Hall of Fame, that is the football owner aspect to Irsay that stands out the most. And I guess to provide a little context around it, and I'm sure there are a lot of our listeners that watch the presentations on an annual basis. I think it's really cool when they do that at Canton or in a year. I can count on one times I've seen an owner present the player. And honestly, on that hand of the 5 fingers I've got, 3 of them, I think, are Jim Irsay. I don't, Mark, you've seen Bears go in there. I mean, it's former teammates present them in. It's former player or former coaches. Mm-hmm. It's their family members. It's their peewee coach. It's their high school coach. It's not the owner of the team. And to take it a step further, the Colts told Edgerrin James that he needed to leave in 2006. Yeah. The Colts told Dwight Freeney in 2013, we're going to have Robert Mathis back and not you. And yet Freeney, Edge, and Marvin, I'd argue 3 very different personalities, let alone 3 very different careers after playing here in Indianapolis, they wanted Jim Irsay. And that has always been something that I'm like, damn, an owner had that type of impact on you. You could pick anybody to present you into the Hall of Fame. And that's who you decided to pick.
You didn't let business get in the way of friendship and loyal, and that's something to behold, because that does not happen in this day and age in the NFL.
And he gave Edge a Super Bowl ring. You know, the year after he had left, they go on to win the Super Bowl. So, I guess just a couple last things, Mark. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of succession plan or anything like that. I think I've shared before, and ironically, we had a Twitter question, I think last podcast, maybe asking about it. I fully expect the daughters to want to continue this. I fully expect Carly, the oldest daughter, to want to kind of spearhead it individually. I've said this before. I think Kaylin, the youngest, is very impressive from a communicative standpoint. She would be one that I would have very front-facing here moving forward. And, you know, Mark, you've seen it with your Bears over the years. I mean, there are women owners throughout the NFL. Yeah. Detroit, Tennessee comes to mind, Seattle, the Benson family in New Orleans, and people are state this, state that. I would like to think and believe when in 2011, whatever it was, they put the vice chair owner tag on the 3 daughters, that they have thought about this a long, long time ago. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the NFL requires you to have a succession plan in place for you to get around the, massive inheritance tax. And remember, these 3 girls, they all grew up here. The 10 grandchildren, they all call Indianapolis home. A lot of times you don't see that, the lake house. I mean, like all of that. I mean, it is in this state. So I'd be very surprised for those on that aspect of it that are worried about that angle to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a conversation for another day and time. But yeah, I totally understand people's questions about it, but you had to have known that the succession plan is in place at some point, and I'm sure those details will leak out once, we get a little further from the immediate aftermath.
Yeah, and I guess last thing, Mark, you could make the argument that maybe, and we might not feel it right now, maybe we'll feel it down the road, but Jim, and credit to his youngest daughter, Kaylin, as well, their very public stance with kicking the stigma might end up being his greatest accomplishment. And I don't know if people fully realize Jim's upbringing. Certainly, he, I'm not here to act like the affluency wasn't there, but Jim's brother died at a young age. His sister died in a car crash at the age of 12. Addiction was rampant in his family. Yes, money is money, but that is not an ideal environment to grow up in whatsoever. And for him to, and to be fair, it did take some time, but for him to be as public as he has been in the last handful of years about mental health, I think there are a lot of people, Braden Smith, probably one of them, with his story, most recently, that people either A, have gotten help via the 20 plus million he has helped raise for mental health, or B, feel more comfortable maybe sharing those thoughts.
I think they think if a guy who's got all the money in the world can be so public with that and all the pressure that comes with owning an NFL franchise and all that stuff, if he can be as public with his struggles, then why can't I? And so I think that is a tremendous thing that he has brought to the table, is that he's been open and honest about his struggles. And our colleague James Boyd mentioned that he commends Jim for doing that, because there are people that have far less money and far less resources than he had that are more open and honest because of that Kicking the Stigma campaign.
No, Mark, I think that's really, really well said. I really don't have anything else to add. I've said this before. I've always thought it's really cool, the continued Chuck Strong Gala. You talk about a fired head coach, the amount of money that's raised for the IU Simon Cancer Center right here in our own backyard. So rest in peace to a man that certainly had his demons, and at times there were some things that he might have said publicly that I didn't totally agree with, but from a passionate, generous owner, a man that I would argue ignited our city and state to, we now play and eat at the same table as the big boys when it comes to the NFL world and events. And there are a lot of people to thank in this city, but he is definitely one of them. He has always been great to me. I don't want to act like I had some, super, super close relationship with him, but always very respectful of me. I felt that in whatever role I was in, or, outside of the organization as well. So, Mark, thank you for filling in for Eddie. Appreciate that. And rest in peace to Jim Irsay.